yet another installment of the Digital Archaeology Group lecture series. A special welcome to anyone tuning in on our live stream through Facebook. It's the first time we're trying this, so if there are any people watching, please comment and say if there are any technical difficulties or anything. Alex will be watching the comments during the lecture. Special welcome also to our speaker, Nicolas Trépanier, who's an associate professor at the University of Mississippi, holding a PhD from Harvard, and he currently has a Urias fellowship at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in Amsterdam, where he does research on the perception of the rural landscape in late medieval Anatolian, and you might have seen him already here at Leiden, a conference on that very subject this February. But he also has a great interest in the relationship between history and video games, which is something he will talk about today. And we are very happy to host this together with the Value Foundation, whose core subject is pretty much exactly this. And so before giving the floor to Nicola, I will invite Aris for a moment to plug this conference.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us organize this. I'm here as a representative of Value. In case you don't know what Value is, Value Foundation is a foundation that works on the intersection between the past at large and video games. So anything from archaeology, history, social sciences, anything related to the past and video games. We're doing it, streams, papers, all sorts of events that we've done here at the faculty and elsewhere. You name it, we're probably doing something related to it. And one of the things we're doing is we're organizing our second conference on video games and archaeology, our second interactive past conference. The first one was organized 2 years ago and resulted in an edited volume. And this year, in October 8 to 10, at the Netherlands Institute for Sound and Vision at Hilversum, we'll be organizing the interactive past conference too. It's absolutely free and open to everyone, whether you're an academic or not, game developer, student, doesn't really matter. It's open for everyone. It will be live streamed as well on our Twitch channel and then later on YouTube. And the call for papers for the conference is still open, and it will be open until the 15th of May. So if you're interested and you would like to present or you have a great idea, please feel free to welcome all sorts of ideas. It doesn't matter, again, if you're a student or a professor or whatever. We are welcoming everybody to send an abstract. So you can go to www.interactivepasts.com and go to the section that says the Interactive Past Conference 2. If I scroll down here, we have our guideline for the paper submission, and you can send an email at ipsitu@interactivepast.com with your abstract. And if you're, this is a picture from our last conference, and if you're interested in what we did 2 years ago, you can check the YouTube playlist with Ipsi One. Maybe you can get ideas. Maybe you can see if this conference is actually what you like. Again, thank you for inviting us here, and I would like to give the floor to Nicolas for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here in some alternative way if you are. I want to start by also thanking our peers. Sorry, I'm sure I'm massacring the pronunciation of your name, as well as the Digital Archaeology Group and Value. This is fun, but it's also important. It's really nice to see that issues like this are beginning to be taken very seriously in academia. 20 years ago, this would have been kind of, a joke among professors, basically. So, and hopefully, I'm gonna pull out enough material to convince you that this was worth it. So, when historians talk about video games, typically, and historical video games, they usually do one thing, which is complain. They complain about the fact that all the facts that the games get wrong. I am a historian. I'm sorry. I've been teaching a course actually on the representations of history in video games for several years now. And one thing that has become very clear to me through that teaching and the thinking that came with it is that there's a lot more to say about this topic than simply making lists of mysteries. So today what I want to do is present to you a couple of observations that I've come across during through that work, and think out loud about how those observations about history and video games might apply to archaeology as well. Keep in mind, I'm not an archaeologist, so you should think of what I'm saying as kind of discussion prompts rather than solid conclusions, food for thought, if you will. So before anything else, the first thing we can say about the way that video games depict the past is that they do it in two main ways, in two different categories of games. The first category is what you see in first-person or third-person games set in 3D environments, like the Assassin's Creed series, for example. Now, in those games, the past usually serves as a background for the action, in a way that's very similar to what you see in historical novels or historical films, for example. Although the fact that games are interactive means that they can also be a little bit more immersive than literature and cinema. The kind of past that you see in those games is most visible in the material culture and in the architecture. And so, in theory, in addition to material culture and architecture, those games would be able to convey the culture of a historical period. But usually, what you end up seeing is really characters dressed up in medieval costumes, running around medieval buildings, and thinking like 21st century people. The other way that games depict the past, the other category, is basically grand strategy games. Like Civilization series, Total War series. And here, the main interface for the player, instead of being a 3D, lifelike 3D environment, the interface typically comes in the shape of a map. And the main concern of those games about the past is much more about evolution over time. Evolution of military power, political power, economic transformations, development of technologies, and so on. So from an archaeological point of view, the big missing piece here is obviously prehistory. When we're talking about the past in video games, we're almost always talking about the historical past. Now, obviously, there's one big exception to that. It's Far Cry Primal, which is set during the Mesolithic period. And I know that there was a discussion of that earlier this year here. I really wish I could have heard the whole thing. But for the time being, just keep in mind that this is an exception, and it's clear that when we're talking about archaeology in the context of my talk, we're mostly talking about archaeology in historical context. So what I want to do is make a three-way comparison between the way that the past is depicted in video games by historians and by archaeologists. So let me start with the pair that I'm most familiar with, which is the relationship between video games and academic history. In general, the work of historians aligns better with the second category of games that I mentioned, grand strategy games like Civilization or Medieval Total War. That alignment comes from the fact that historians usually concentrate on changes over time, especially the kind of gradual changes that's at the core of the mechanics of those games. So in other words, if you're a historian working on the economy of early modern Europe, you'll find something that relates to your research in a game that lets you run the Habsburg Empire and sign trade agreements and build economic structures and things like that. But by contrast, in a 3D third-person game like Assassin's Creed Unity, which is set in the French Revolution, maybe you'll hear a character in the background talking about, the price of food or the availability of food, something like that. But that's pretty much all the economic history that you'll find in that game. And so as an academic historian, it's going to be really hard to connect this with the work that you're doing. The problem with games in this category here, like Assassin's Creed, is that the depiction that they make of the past is very static. They tell stories in which the characters themselves might change, but the setting itself is going to remain the same, which is not really in tune with the way that historians think about the past. Now, that being said, there are exceptions, obviously, among historians. There are some historians whose work described the past in a way as it was in a given point in time. I'm one of those cases, actually. My own research is about medieval Anatolia, and games that present the past in a 3D environment like that, they can do a fairly good job at representing this kind of snapshot of culture and human evolution at a given point in time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, they're very good at representing material culture and architecture. In other words, the visual experience of the past. But the big missed opportunity in those games, the thing that they don't, or at least they don't yet do a very good job at, is representing the ways of thinking of people in the past. I'll give you just one example of what I mean here. So I wrote my dissertation on food in medieval Anatolia. And it became very clear to me that when you look at the way that people in medieval Anatolia thought about health, the way that they thought about the relationship between food and health, and so on and so forth, that it became very clear to me that they followed the ideas of Galen, the Galenic theory about health. So many of you will be familiar with this idea that the human body is regulated by 4 liquids or 4 humors, blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. And the idea is that if there's a balance between those 4 liquids, you're going to be healthy, and if there's imbalance between them, you're going to be sick. And some foods, in that theory, some foods will help certain humor go up and some others go down. So depending on the kind of imbalance that you have in your body, depending on the way that you're sick, the same food item might make you more sick, or it can actually cure you. So my point here is that this element of medieval Anatolian culture, this idea that the body is regulated by those humans, that could be represented in a 3D virtual environment. It would be really easy to create a game mechanic, for example, where the character's health is based on the balance between 4 different measures, and so different kinds of imbalance would require different kinds of treatment. And that kind of cultural characteristic is much easier to represent in a game like Assassin's Creed than in a game like Civilization. So it would be a natural fit there. But I'm talking about potential here, essentially because the ways in which people thought in earlier historical periods tend to be overlooked by game designers. And as I said, typically the characters in those games tend to think like modern people without, a lot of reflection about that. Now, moving on to archaeology. Now, of course, archaeologists study changes over time, changes in technology, changes in trade networks, agricultural practices, and so on and so forth. But if you compare the way that historians and archaeologists think about the past, it's a lot more usual and it's a lot more legitimate for archaeologists to talk about what you could call the habitual past. In other words, talking less about, not necessarily about this is what happened, but rather this is what would happen. This is what typically happened, describing a situation. So as a historian, my interest in taking a snapshot of daily life in medieval Anatolia, that makes me a little bit marginal among historians, but that's actually fairly mainstream way of thinking in archaeology. And obviously, a snapshot of culture at a given moment is what you have in the games like Assassin's Creed series. And I would venture to say that whereas words are the natural home of historians, archaeologists feel much more constrained by words as a medium. Which is why when historians publish illustrations, generally it's because, you know, the picture looks nice. Whereas when archaeologists publish illustrations, it's usually because words by themselves are not sufficient to convey everything that they're trying to convey in their publication. In fact, words are so insufficient to archaeologists that they often need different types of illustrations to fully convey what they found in their research. So by that logic, a moving 3D representation of objects, moving 3D representations of architecture as it is being used, seems like a natural extension of the archaeological tradition. So when you compare the two disciplines, history and archaeology, in their outreach effort, it's also not really a surprise to see that public archaeologists are ahead of public historians in borrowing gaming technologies to create 3D virtual environments and so on. So all of this to say is that there are two main ways for video games to represent the past: the civilization approach, the kind of Assassin's Creed approach. And as a very general rule, Assassin's Creed is closer to archaeologists and civilization is closer to historians. Now, moving on to the second part of this presentation, I want to talk about one specific issue that is approached very differently in those three different types of representations of the past. And that's the question of narrative. And I would argue that it's important to talk about narrative because narrative storytelling, if you will, is one of the most universal ways to in which people, academic or not, organize their knowledge and convey their knowledge, share their knowledge, communicate. So it's a very powerful communication tool. So let's start with video games. When academics started looking seriously at video games in the late 1990s, early 2000s, one of the first debates that kind of that arose in that new field of video game studies was about how to characterize video games as a medium. So in one corner, you had some scholars of video game studies who thought of video games as a narrative medium. And for those people, the quote-unquote the narratologists, from their perspective, you can import a lot of methodological tools from other disciplines that study other narrative media. So, you know, you can borrow from cinema studies, you can borrow from literary criticism, and so on and so forth. Now, narratologists would completely acknowledge that video games are interactive, but they would say that this interactivity is just basically one different tool that you have in order to tell a story. So that's one point. Other side of that debate, you had scholars who thought of video games first and foremost as games, and nicknamed the ludologists. And the idea for them is that the fundamental element of video games are game rules. So scholarship on video games has to center on parallels with other types of games that are not computer-based. You know, you have to compare video games to sports or to board games, for example, because the game rules for this group of scholars, game rules are really what shape the experience of the player more than anything. This is a debate that has largely died out, mainly because scholars of video game studies realize that these are not necessarily mutually exclusive ways to think about games, but also because they came to the realization that different game genres don't relate to narrative in the same way. So to take extreme examples here, on the one hand, if you have games like Firewatch or What Remains of Edith Finch, which are essentially stories that are kind of, they have a couple of interactive elements, but really, I mean, it's mostly people telling you a story and you kind of process it. Contrast that with games like FIFA or Tetris, for example. You see that some game experiences are almost all about the storytelling, and other game experiences are almost all about the game mechanics. So one more thing about this. Back in the early days of video game studies, the great hope of the narratologists, the the Moby Dick of narratology, if you will, was emergent storytelling. In other words, the hope that one day video games would actually create their own stories. They would become kind of computer-generated stories, essentially. And over the past 20 years, the thing that's really striking about this is that it has emphatically not happened. Right? In other words, the stories that we find in video games are almost always stories created by the game designers, as opposed to stories that are created by the game itself. And I'll come back to why it's important a little bit. Now, moving on to talk about the relationship between history and narrative. Obviously, there's a connection here in the fact that the word story and history are semantically are they're from the same root, essentially. They come from the same place. It's almost the same word, right? And that is a connection that's not just between the words, but it's also the practice of representing history and the practice of storytelling. These are practices that are very closely related. You can track that back, at the very least, back to Herodotus, and probably even long before that. However, for historians today, if you think about narrative as a historian, the big deal is not so much Herodotus, but rather a guy named Hayden White. Hayden White became somewhat of an infamous figure in the history departments in the 1970s, because basically in the 1970s published a series of articles and eventually books that essentially declared that historians are fiction writers. This might sound a little bit crazy, but he's actually making an interesting point. So let me walk you through it. So when you write history, you have to make choices. Obviously, you start from the big chaotic mess that is history itself. But in order to write something that makes sense, you have to make choices. So you have to take a starting point, the story that you're going to tell. You have to pick an end point. You have to figure out which characters are going to be the central characters. You have to decide which events are going to be the most important, the secondary events, or the events that you won't mention at all. And you have to describe also how you're going to explain the relationship between those people and events. So there's no way to avoid making those changes, those choices. And Hayden White was saying that not only you have to make those choices, but when you're making those choices, they shape the depiction of history that you end up producing. Because in making those choices, you unconsciously follow the conventions of storytelling. For example, you're going to present some characters as being the heroes or the villains, or you're going to organize your presentation of events in a way that follows the conventions of satire or drama or tragedy and so on. So the book that you end up writing as a historian, the book that you end up writing is a better representation of your literary imagination than a representation of the past itself. And this is unavoidable. This is Hayden White's perspective. So give you an example of concretely what that looks like. I teach mostly Middle Eastern history. And when I present my students with the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, I mentioned that just picking the starting point of that story already betrays which side of that conflict you're supporting. Some people will start 3,000 years ago, and the story that they will tell will be the epic of a people returning home after several millennia of suffering. Other people will start with much later, with modern Zionism, and the story that they will tell is a tragedy of an invasion from outsiders that leads to dispossession and taking away land. Both of these representations can be completely factually correct. I mean, you don't need to lie in either one of these, okay? You can say completely the truth in both cases, and yet you end up with very, very different depictions of the past, because the starting point that you're picking is different because the character that are at the center of the story are different because the events that are important or less important are emphasized in a different way. And there's no way to avoid making those choices. I mean, you cannot talk about that history without starting somewhere, giving a date, starting at a specific point in time. In other words, no matter how neutral you try to be, as a historian, you cannot escape the conventions of storytelling. Now, a lot of historians really hate and white idea, and you can understand why. I mean, we as historians, we go around thinking of ourselves as uncovering the past. And this guy comes in and he basically says, no, you're just making it up, essentially, and kind of insults it. But his challenge has led to some self-questioning among historians, which is quite an accomplishment, considering that history is arguably the least self-reflective and self-critical discipline of all the humanities and social sciences. So for me and for many of my colleagues, it has pushed us to think about how we organize our work, has pushed us to prioritize questions over stories. And in my case, it has pushed me to write in a descriptive rather than narrative way. So, I think bring back something I said earlier. When you find stories in video games, it's almost in all cases, these are stories that are written by the game designers. They're written from scratch by the game designers. In other words, it's a set of information that has been invented rather than selected by the game designer. And that applies even to what's commonly referred to as the lore of a game. So you have some game series in science fiction and fantasy especially, where the setting and the character in which the story takes place is have very complex backstories. If you have the Elder Scrolls series or the Fallout series, for example, what you're playing, your character is playing in a world that's presented as having had a lot of things that happened in that world before the beginning of the game. Now, these are presented as being histories, but we need to remember that these histories, in contrast to the histories written by historians based in the real world, they're not drawing from the big chaotic mess of data that is the past itself. In fact, there's only one game that I know, and there might be others, but there's only one game I know that is complicated enough to generate this kind of chaos, this kind of massive chaos of data, and therefore allow the player to pick out certain elements from that mass of data and create stories out of this. In the same way, in a way that's very similar to the way that historians pick elements from the big mess of data of the real times. And that game is a game called Crusader Kings 200 hours of my life. The fact is that the stories that you find in that game are in some fundamental ways very different from the stories that you'll find in the lore of Fallout or the lore of Skyrim. And I would go as far as saying that these differences between the kind of narrative that you find in the lore of Fallout 4 and the stories of Crusader Kings 2, that might, in some ways, the differences between this and the previous case I mentioned, that is an argument against Hayden White's claim that there's no difference between writing history and writing fiction. Because here you are selecting from a big chaotic mass. In the other case, you're just making up stuff completely from scratch. And I think that the result ends up being different. So where does archaeology fit in all of this? I suspect that there's a lot of different ways to address that question. But let me start with something that happened earlier this year. Last winter, I went to Portugal and I spent a week on a survey campaign with a couple of people that are here today. And I don't have a formal training in archaeology, but I've been reading archaeological publications for many years now. And one thing that I realized during that week on the campaign was that merely reading publications from a foreign discipline is very different from actually eavesdropping on the conversations of people within that discipline. I notice a lot of things. Most of them are very, very good, of course. But one thing that really struck me is how anonymous and impersonal the character of the way that archaeologists talk about the people that they study, which is very different from what I'm used to as a historian. So as a historian, I can imagine a situation where I would know 2-3 things about one specific individual who lived in the past. And typically that's going to be, essentially what I can find in 1 or 2 archival documents. So you can imagine, for example, that there's this guy that I know his name was Mehmet. I know that he lived in a village close to Ankara, and I know that he was expected to pay a certain amount of taxes in 1596. And that's basically everything that I will ever know about this guy. Now, contrast that with archaeological knowledge. On the one hand, there's an incredibly intimate connection that's made with the people that you study. You can stand in a room where those people slept, walk around the landscape they inhabited. You can hold a bowl in which they were eating their breakfast. You can feel the traces of a knife on the sheep bone that tells you, how did they slaughter that sheep. Right? In fact, you can go as far as manipulating the bones of those people, which is arguably more intimate than pretty much anything you will hopefully ever do with your life partner. So there is a physical closeness here that's pretty extraordinary. There's an intimacy that's really, really salient. And yet, on the other hand, these very same people to whom you're literally so physically close, these people remain most of the time completely anonymous. You don't know their names. Not only that, but in many cases, you don't even know whether you're dealing with 1 or 3 or half a dozen individuals. And when you connect that with the idea of narrative, that's when a big, major structural problem arises. Because it's nearly impossible to tell a story without characters. So it does raise the question of how much narrative you can create from archaeological material, and whether narrative can be of any relevance to archaeology. Now, obviously, there's been discussions on this, there's been work on this. You have some cases, for example, of archaeologists who've written in narrative form by putting themselves at the center of their stories. But in such cases, the story that they tell is the story of discovering the past rather than a depiction of the past. We also have a couple of very marginal cases, very creative archaeologists who've gone all in and actually invented stories set in the past that are meant to convey the content of what they've discovered, what they've discovered through their research. And in doing that, they have to actually invent the characters that they present. But these are, again, very marginal. So, a couple of observations in order to conclude all of this. First thing is that there's a couple of things you need to remember about narrative. Narrative might be the most familiar and catchy and universal way to convey information, but it also requires some basic elements to be created. It requires characters, it requires events, it requires a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I would argue that since historians have easier access than archaeologists to individual characters and events, I haven't talked about events, but obviously that follows more or less the same pattern. This means that it's easier for historians to use narrative. And in fact, I would go as far as claiming that this easier access to narrative at least partly explains why it is easier for historians to reach a broader popular audience than archaeologists. If you look at bestseller lists, you see more historians or historical themes than archaeologists and archaeological. That's the first observation. Second thing, narrative is familiar and it's practical, but it's not the only way to convey information. And the medium of video games actually gives us some really interesting alternatives that were not visible before, really. So remember what I said about video games. Some of them are very story-centric, whereas others are structured around game mechanics. Obviously, some of them combine both, but that's, you have this kind of spectrum. And that second model, the idea of a game that's really about the game mechanics, that doesn't really care all that much about the story, that has brought to the broader culture the idea of gamification, which is to say using game mechanics outside of video games to engage with your audience by giving them quests and small tasks and rankings and badges and things like that. And in a way, I would argue that this kind of approach is actually a much better fit for public archaeology projects. Third thing, whereas historical knowledge can easily be expressed in words, archaeological knowledge requires more than words. In fact, a lot of archaeological knowledge relates to physical and visual and embodied experiences of space and material culture that are much better represented in an immersive virtual environment than in articles and books. So it might be a fruitful exercise for archaeologists to ask themselves the question, what would I be able to say about my research findings if I were to present them not in a journal or in a book, but rather as an interactive, immersive experience for my audience? Now, you might not end up actually creating that experience, but just thinking about it like that might push you to think about the contents that you've uncovered in a different way. And to me, that's the key benefit of looking at video games. The fact that it gives me a way to look differently at material and practices that I'm familiar with. It doesn't mean that I'm going to create a game myself. I mean, if anything, I'm very aware of my skill limitations in that. And I've seen people trying to do that who didn't have the skill. I don't want to be one of these people. It doesn't mean, and it certainly doesn't mean that I figured out what's good for every art historian and for every archaeologist. But as I said at the beginning of this talk, I hope that at least, it pushes you to think in slightly different ways, that I've given you some food for thought, even though we have to acknowledge that there's quite a bit of cooking that still needs to be done. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. First of all, I have to say that our screencast has already paid off, because we received an invitation from the Digital Archaeology Group at Brown University. If you would be available to give a talk there.
Wow, okay, that's great.
First of all, are there any questions from the audience here?
I feel like I'm on American Idol or something.
So do you think that games could be a learning source, for example, for schools or university students?
Well, I mean, the obvious case here is the new Assassin's Creed game, right? That has, I mean, most of you will be familiar with that. I mean, it's set in ancient Egypt, but they came out with a version of the game that allows you to kind of explore without having to kind of kill people, essentially. There is, I mean, yes, there is potential there. The thing that I haven't seen, okay, two things about this. One positive, one negative. On the positive side, I've seen up until, I would say, 5-10 years ago, representations of history that I saw in video games were essentially entirely fed by popular perspectives on history. And the thing that I've started seeing about the time of Assassin's Creed Black Flag, which is set in the Caribbean, probably might have started before that, but in that game, what I noticed by talking with one of my colleagues who works on the Caribbean at that time is that they introduced elements that are historically accurate, but that most people don't know about. And so in that sense, there is hope that that the video games are kind of taking and drifting away from just kind of representing popular perspectives. So that's one thing. Other thing, however, is that I think that there's a very, very, very big divide between the way that game designers think about those and the way that historians think about those. And obviously, the same thing would be true with archaeologists. And the problem is that up to now, what I've seen is historians being kind of tacked on later on in the process. And that, to me, I mean, yes, there's potential there, but if you want to make something that historians will recognize as legitimate, and probably the same thing for archaeologists, I think that the scholars would need to be involved in the basic design, if you will.
So that's something that we value in Deutsche quite a bit, exactly the bridge between game developers and scientists. So we were thinking that it's mostly us meeting the game developers rather than the other way around, because at the end of the day, Assassin's Creed or Civilization or whatever still selling millions of copies and make billions of dollars despite not being particularly accurate. Yeah. It's not always. But I think it's a bit of our responsibility in doing so, in reaching out to developers and saying, hey, look, we can help you make this slightly better, but it's also, you sort of need to make a case for why it needs to be better. Because right now, they are extremely successful. Mm-hmm. So we would also have to convince the game developers that it would actually matter if their games were more historically accurate. But still, I think we can use games for education, even though games like Fallout, like you said, it's a very good example of collapse, and then you can present a case of how collapse works in video games. Or how do we think about it in history? I think it's most important for us to just reach out and just talk to developers or go out there and find them, because they are not going to come to us. Or they will. I know that they mostly like do Wikipedia research, for example, for us.
Painfully aware.
Yeah. So I think we should be responsible.
So two things I want to say about this. I think you're absolutely right. In addition to that, you have to think about, obviously games are commercial products, right? And their idea of what's successful or not is first and foremost whether it sells or not. And in that context, when they present the games as historically accurate, it's a sales argument, it's a marketing argument. And so maybe that's kind of a breach we can enter in that way, pressure them like that. That's one thing. The other thing is maybe my biggest hope in that respect is not so much Ubisoft and Bethesda and those places, but rather the independent games. In that sense that, in recent years, and I mean, this as well as I do, the cost and the complexity of making games has gone down tremendously, and now it's possible for very small teams to create games. And it has, because it's so much cheaper to make it, you can take more risks, and so you end up having much more modest games that touch aspects of history and probably could touch archaeology as well, in a way that I'm thinking of, for example, Papers, Please, that kind of recreates the practice of border control in the Soviet era, or This War of Mine that's set during the siege of Sarajevo in the 90s. These are games that will not be as comprehensive as the world of an Assassin's Creed game. They're going to be much more modest in their scope, but what they're trying to depict, they might do it in a very, very clever way, and hopefully, it might be easier for historians and archaeologists to integrate those themes in a more organic way.
I have a question. I like this, but I think we're still talking about public outreach possibilities. Yeah. Do you think in an ideal world where you could put your whole data set into a game engine, do you think it would be also of added value as a proper research tool?
Okay, so I can give you one very specific example of something that looks like a game, but that's not meant to be for public consumption. It's like, which is what's called the agent-based simulation. Some of you will be familiar with that. The idea that you have like a whole population where every individual has a number of variables, and you run simulations on what happens. Concretely, in my field, there's a very interesting case that was made by a team of historians and archaeologists, one of the few groups that kind of meshes those two disciplines in my field, where they looked at the campaign of Manzika. So late 11th century, Byzantine Empire is being attacked by the Turks coming from Central Asia, and they bring this huge army from what today is Istanbul all the way to what today is Eastern Turkey. And what this team did is that they took data from the land, so where water would have been, what the topography of the terrain would have been, where cultivated land would have been, where food would have been. And then they modeled individual soldiers with variables like how much money, how much food did they need, how much water did they need, how far from the camp they would go in order to get those things, how likely they were to get sick if they did something, things like that. And they ran a bunch of simulations like that allowed them to make a pretty good guess of what was the path that this army actually took. So, I mean, I think that, and I'm sure that there's a whole bunch of examples like that among just within archaeology also. But yeah, so that's and that kind of agent-based simulation is very similar to what you'll have in the Total War games, for example, the battlefield simulation. So in that sense, there's definitely gaming technology that can be imported like that. Now that being said, you need obviously the scholars to understand that, which is, I don't know for archaeologists, but for historians, that's a tall order.
About the terminology you use the word depiction
Yeah.
and depicting. Well, I speak usually in the knowledge of about 3 years in archaeology. We're more familiar with the word visualization, and we always refer to things or visualize things instead of depicting. And in a way, I think it says something about the way we use 3D or game technology to present it. Not as much to tell a story, but to describe or to make more beautiful things for the audience. So I think we definitely have a point in underlining how we would use the technology in general. And then as for the new experiments and archaeological games, great for the word. New game will be released. It's called Videogames, and it's about Etruscans. Yes, no,
Yeah,
it's just by accident today will be released, and it is an interesting experiment because it's the entertainment game app, the company that built in, and this is a sort of crowdsourcing project because archaeologists have been involved to actually provide material because they, of course, had to construct a framework to objects, so they actually needed archaeological objects to be inserted in the game, and not everything was published or available in the museum. So in that sense, it was crowdsourced thanks to the participation of museums and archaeological art, and the fact that the name of the game is even as much as it's a person, so you will impersonate a public figure within a game in Syria, and you have to build up your own city, and that city will probably have to find out if it's a real war between different city-states during the peak of the age. So in a way, there are new components in this game that I can see and also in your observations. There is this first person, it's you, so it's a name, one character, but finally archaeologists have been forced to give a name, and of course, because the narratives are full of names, and we have many documents and also more known characters, but also and it's also a strategic type of game for the usual world in a way we're getting there. But the funny thing is that we've been involved to have by the developers to have machine learning.
So you were part of this?
No, I have colleagues that actually out of their curiosity and they just volunteered and they started selling things because they're very interested in live video games. So, and there are many, and I have to say this, there have been more than one big event about games and but yeah, it's from what I know, this is the kind of event. It's involving archaeologists already in the development of one game, just to have a real object that has been found and that is reliable.
Thank you for that. And I have to say, if I were part of a project like that on the archaeological side of this, the thing that I'd like to do is to think a little bit about what is it that the game designers are asking from me that I feel uncomfortable with, and what is it that I would like to give them that they're not interested in, because as a way to start thinking about the preconceptions that I have about my own field, because that's one thing that again, I think that archaeology is more self-reflective than history in that respect, but we're trained as historians to write articles and write books, and there's a whole bunch of things that this allows us to do and prevents us from doing, and we completely internalize those rules and we stop thinking about them. I mean, there is this really, really, really irritating thing that every historian does, which is that when you're not sure what to say about something, you don't talk about it, And if you're creating a 3D virtual environment, you can't just this building. Well, I don't know what it looked like. I'm just going to put a black hole there. You cannot do that, right? So that kind of translation from one medium to another, it's the opportunity to start figure out what are your own blind spots. So yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Can you say anything about detail in people biology? How important is it? Understanding about it?
Yeah. Can I say it? I mean, the easy answer is no. Can I say anything? Yeah, no. It's. I think there's a lot to be thought about there. The thinking that I haven't done. Just off the top of my head, I will mention just one thing. Well, two things. One is that the more photorealistic the representation is, or the depiction, or the visualization, whichever word you want to use on this, the more it's kind of an argument of authority, right? If you have characters that are dressed up, are kind of cartoonish, you're going to say, well, this is probably not very realistic. Whereas if it's almost lifelike, you're going to assume that it's more true, which is very treacherous. It's in that sense, we have to be critical about this, and usually we're not. That's one thing. The other thing is, I remember one of my graduate school teachers, who is a historian of early American history, and she was involved in making a documentary that was based on a book that she had written. At some point, so part of the documentary was her talking, and part of it was kind of reenactments of events that she talks about in her book. And there was a dinner scene at some point that's set in colonial New England, and in the middle of the table you had an iceberg lettuce, and she freaked out because there were no iceberg lettuce at that time. And she got really kind of stuck on those kind of details. And she says that after a while, she kind of relaxed about it because she realized that what they were trying to convey through that documentary was not, the history of iceberg lettuces or any other type of lettuce. That, in that sense, you can tolerate a certain degree of imprecision and inaccuracies in that. That being said, I think that this is a question that people engage with those kind of depictions should think about explicitly, not just kind of make assumptions. So I think that what you're talking about here is something that needs to be raised to the surface, and it's not there. I think it's very important, but that doesn't mean that I have something really insightful to say about it.
Alex, do we maybe have burning questions from the line? Maybe one. Question.
Yeah. I've got one question from Gary Nobles. He's saying, what role does psychology have in terms of exploring past human behavior within a computer game context?
That's a good one. Yeah, no, it's a very good question because in some respects, the work that I do as my main research as a historian is connected with psychology. I mean, I worked, as I said, on food and daily life in medieval Anatolia before. Now I'm working on landscapes and perception of place still in that same time period. And obviously, there are certain aspects of the human experience that are universal, and there are some others that are based in culture. And I would say that ideally, the division of labor here would be that psychologists look at what's universal, and historians look at what's historically contingent, what changes from time period to time period. That being said, obviously there are problems in there. There are problems like in the field of psychology. There's been a realization that for a long time, almost all the experiments were made on basically white male college students from Europe and North America, and that was kind of generalized to the entirety of humankind. And that's something that the field has realized is problematic, and suddenly you have a much more kind of sophisticated thinking about that within that field. Conversely, to me, when I think about those issues in my own research work, I'm trying to, it's not so much, I mean, yes, psychology is important. I mean, my mother was a psychology teacher, so obviously, she fed me quite a bit of information from that, and that has shaped the way that I think about certain issues. For example, about visual perception of landscape. But beyond that, what I find interesting is to again eavesdrop on conversations in other fields and see what I find disturbing about it or what I find enlightening about it. And one of those examples that's partly psychology, partly video game studies, partly computer science is the idea of presence, the idea of what are the factors that makes a 3D virtual environment feel more realistic. And one of the things that I want to do that I haven't done yet is to kind of dig into that and look at the conversations that have happened in that and ask myself, so what you're saying about, this makes the experience more realistic or less realistic, would that fit for a medieval Anatolian peasant? Would that make the experience more realistic for him or for her as well? And I think that in that sense, here you have another opportunity for thinking critically about your own assumptions within your own field by looking outside. That being said, I'm sure that psychologists would read my work and tell me I'm wrong in so many different ways, so I apologize.
I think with that apology, we should conclude this discussion. Those of you present here can continue the discussion over drinks in the main hall. I would like to thank Nicolas one more time for this fascinating lecture.
Thank you.
And one more thing about the Digital Archaeology Group. Our next slot in June is still available. So if you are here and not doing field work,